Today, we're digging into a really critical question for Nepal. Is the country's greatest asset, the stunning scenery that brings in tourists from all over the world, actually its greatest economic weakness?
This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media, and what it uncovers is a fascinating and, frankly, a pretty worrying economic paradox right at the heart of the Himalayan nation.
This single sentence just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the problem. On the surface, you've got this picture of a vibrant, booming tourism industry. But when you look underneath, when you actually crunch the numbers, the data reveals a much, much more fragile reality.
So first, let's really get our heads around this paradox. Think of it as Nepal's gilded economic cage, where this beautiful image, this picture-perfect economy, might actually be masking some really deep structural vulnerabilities.
And here's where you can really see that disconnect. The official story, the one you see in all the glossy Visit Nepal campaigns. It's all about record tourist numbers and Nepal being this global hub for adventure. But the hard data tells a totally different story. We're talking declining industrial output, manufacturing that's going nowhere, and a foundation that is fundamentally fragile. So while the country celebrates a great tourist season, it's kind of like ignoring all the flashing red lights on the economic dashboard.
Okay, so why? Why is this model that's so focused on tourism considered so fragile? Let's pull it apart and look at the core vulnerabilities. Turns out there are three really critical flaws here. First, you've got extreme seasonality. This creates these intense boom and bust cycles, which, let's be honest, is no way to build a modern, stable economy. Second, it's incredibly vulnerable to things that happen outside its borders. A pandemic, a recession halfway across the world, some geopolitical tremor, any of it can wipe out a whole year's progress in an instant. And third, and this is a big one, is a huge problem called import leakage. It's a fancy term for when tourist dollars don't actually stay in the country. We'll break that down right now.
So what exactly is this import leakage? Well, here's the textbook definition. It's when that tourism revenue, instead of circulating and boosting the local economy, flows right back out of the country to pay for all the imported stuff the industry needs to meet tourist expectations.
And this slide just illustrates it perfectly. Here's how it works. A tourist comes in and pays for a nice high-end hotel. But then what does the hotel do? It uses that money to buy imported Irish whiskey, Swiss chocolate, maybe some foreign-made furniture. And what's the result? A huge chunk of that tourist's dollar ends up stimulating a factory somewhere in Europe or Asia, not one in Nepal. The money just pleaks out.
All right, so this brings us to the flip side of the coin. If tourism isn't the strong foundation everyone thinks it is, why hasn't Nepal's own industrial sector grown to fill that gap?
It's the central question facing the country's economic planners, right? With so much potential just sitting there, what is holding its industry back? Well, the analysis points to a really interesting diagnosis. They call it a policy schizophrenia. And what that means is that political willpower and private money, they tend to just follow the path of least resistance. So instead of doing the hard, long-term work of building up industry, that energy and capital gets diverted to easier, short-term wins. Things like real estate speculation that's fueled by money sent home from abroad.
And the result of that? Well, it's stark. Manufacturing contributes less than 5% to Nepal's GDP. This isn't just stagnation. The source calls it deindustrialization by default. The country isn't actively trying to shut down factories. It's just letting the conditions for them to survive completely wither away through neglect.
And here we get to the absolute heart of the problem. The single biggest physical barrier, the one thing that's been crippling industrial growth, has been energy. For years, industries dealt with insane power cuts. And even now, the lack of abundant, reliable, and cheap power makes it practically impossible for Nepali goods to compete with those from its giant neighbors, India and China.
So, if tourism is a weak foundation, and industry is stalled because it lacks power, what's the answer? Well, this analysis proposes a pretty radical pivot, reframing Nepal's greatest natural resource away from scenery and towards energy. Now this chart puts the sheer scale of the opportunity into perspective. Just look at this. Bhutan has successfully built its economy by exporting hydropower to India. But Nepal's commercially viable potential, 42,000 megawatts, absolutely dwarfs Bhutan's. We're not just talking about a resource here. This is a strategic asset on the level of Middle Eastern oil, and it's sitting right next door to some of the most energy-hungry markets on the planet.
And here's exactly why hydropower is a much better economic anchor. Unlike tourism, you can sign these things called power purchase agreements, or PPAs. They're basically long-term contracts to sell electricity at a fixed price. That gives you stable, predictable, dollar-denominated revenue. A finance minister can actually build a national budget based on a PPA. You can't do that with wishy-washy tourist numbers. And, most importantly, it provides the cheap, reliable energy needed to finally kickstart industrialization.
So all of this leads to a very clear fork in the road. And honestly, the choices that are made in the next few years are going to define Nepal's economic path for the rest of this century.
On one side, you have the muddle-through path. That's a future where the country continues to rely on tourism and remittances, where it stays vulnerable to global shocks and the brain drain of its best talent just keeps going. But on the other side, there's the strategic pivot, a path built on stable revenue from power exports. This then fuels industrial growth, gets rid of deficits, and creates the kinds of high-skilled domestic jobs that can actually reverse that brain drain and build real economic sovereignty.
So the choice, as this analysis puts it, is pretty clear. Keep selling scenery or finally start building the economic engine. After seeing all the data, the potential of that strategic pivot seems undeniable. The real question now is whether there's the political will to actually take that path.